Do you know that when the Americans first arrived over on this continent in 1607, they were doing things just about the way they were done 5,000 years before? Fantastic. They arrived over there in little boats that weren't even as big as some of the boats of the Phoenicians and the Egyptians and the Sea Kings. And they brought with them the same tools that were used in ancient China, Egypt, Babylonia, and so forth. The hoe and the shovel and the pick and the axe. They were reaping their grain with scythes, just like they did 5,000 years ago. They were threshing it the same way. They were riding around in little carts pulled by oxen. They were spinning thread on a wheel, just like they did 5,000 years ago. They were putting it together and weaving it just like they did 5,000 years ago. And from 1607 at Jamestown until 1981, we made a 5,000-year leap in 200 years as a result of opening the floodgates of human ingenuity and human freedom for the first time in the recorded history of mankind. And so we called our book The 5,000-Year Leap. And we've outlined every one of those 28 great principles so a person can understand them. When I was taking constitutional law, I wondered why somebody hadn't done that. Why were we sweating through these cases one by one, trying to glean out these little fragments, and then sometimes it was distorted. So I thought, if I ever get time or an opportunity, I'm going to take their writings and put their ideas together so that the average person can read as he runs and say, that's what would make a great free nation. And so we finally completed that after all these years. Well, when they came together to form the Constitution, they had to do something that had never been done before in human history, recorded history that is. And there had been other great civilizations, but not described in history. And so now you will turn to your little book called What's Left, What's Right, and we'll trace rather quickly about one semester of political science. If you can carry away the message of this little book, which could be a 600-page book, and I made it into about 25 pages or less, 22 pages, so that you could remember it. Do you notice how many 600-page books you can't remember? 22-page books you do a little better with, providing you'll do what every college student learns how to do. Have you got a pencil? If you haven't, borrow one from your neighbor. Any of you have got more than one, please pass it around. This is how you learn to become good students. Underlining, taking notes, filling in blanks. This is called programmed learning. And that's the way you put it in your brain so that it's yours, not the man who wrote the book. It becomes yours. All right, now let me just ask you, how many of you have seen in the paper lately references to the right wing and the left wing? How many of you have noticed that lately? Right wing, left wing. What is the left wing identified with? Communism. What's the right wing identified with? Fascism. We were all taught that in school. I came up as a political science major. And that's all I was told about, the necessity to avoid the two extremes of communism and fascism. Those are political parties, of course. The Founding Fathers would have said, I never heard anything so ludicrous in my life as this. That's what one of the Founding Fathers, I'm sure, would have said if he were here. That's no way to measure government. You don't measure in terms of political parties. You see what they're referring to are the way the parliaments are seated over in Europe. For example, if you were standing at the front of any of the parliaments of Europe, they are seated because they have many parties. And they start over from the chairman's left. It would be your right sitting down there, but his left. And over here you have the fanatical, radical, terroristic, revolutionary parties, usually represented by the communists, PLO or whatever they've allowed to come in and be represented. It will drift across to the Christian Democrats, the Socialist Democrats, other parties, and over here until it arrives over here to the militarist dictatorships, and they're called the fascists. When you're talking about right and left, that is a reference to political parties in Europe. And the founders would have said political parties shift from generation to generation. They're built on on shifting sand. Don't use that as a method of looking for the ideal form of government. We have a better way. So will you go down into the second paragraph, third line, and underline leftist and rightist. See those two words? Leftist and rightist. And come clear down now 2 more paragraphs just above the headline there, and go up 4 lines to communism and fascism. Those are the 2 things that are identified with it. Now will you come down 2 lines to police state. Do you notice that? Police state. These are both representatives of the police state. The founders would have said, that's not your choice between fascism and communism. Those aren't the 2 opposing alternates from which you choose. They're both virtually the same. Ask anybody who's lived under communism, fascism, or Nazism, and they'll say it's virtually identical. It's a police state with concentration camps, Gestapos and Ogpus, and cruelty and terror. No unalienable rights respected there. Expropriation of property. It's a police state system. And the founders would have said, that's a very poor way to judge government. So the founders had a better way. First of all, will you underline the definition of what government is? The dictionary says it's a system of ruling or controlling. It's a system of ruling or controlling. And so now come down to the next to the last line of that paragraph, and underline, you don't judge government in terms of political parties, but in terms of the political power that that particular system exercises. Then you can evaluate the different types of government and decide which one provides for freedom. So underline not political parties, political power is the way to judge them. Now the founders said there are 2 opposing positions that you must avoid. And in the second line, you have the first one, the number 1, it's anarchy. Right in the middle of the line, underline anarchy. And then go over to the rest of the line. The other opposite position is tyranny. You're trying to avoid anarchy on one extreme and tyranny on the other. Now, underline anarchy again in the next line, because that represents no government, no law, no control. At the other extreme, you have a tyranny, which is too much control, is in the next line. Too much. And then the last word of that paragraph is tyranny. That's what you're trying to avoid. Those are the 2 things from which you're making your selection. Anarchy on one extreme and tyranny on the other. You've got to find the balance center in between them, where you have enough government to maintain justice and security, but not enough to abuse the people. That's the genius the founders are looking for. So in your last paragraph there, notice balance center. Get those 2 words? That's what you're looking for. Some people ask me, Dr. Skousen, does the Freeman Institute take a position of extreme rightism? No. Well, where are you coming from? We're coming from the balance center, right where the founding fathers did. Oh, you mean you're moderates? No. A moderate is a person who sits on the fence and he just goes whichever way the current is. You know, that's popular with some politicians. You're neither hot nor cold. You're just right there seeing which way the mainstream is going to go. No, the founders took a firm, fixed position. This was not a wiggle-wobbly position at all. A firm, fixed position in the balance center of the spectrum, and they intended to stay there forever if possible. And that's what the Constitution was supposed to do. And if you don't violate the Constitution, that's where we stay. All right, now, on the next page, let's give, right there in the middle of the paragraph, do you find people's law? Underline people's law. Somewhere between anarchy at one extreme and tyranny at the other, you'll find a place where the people can set up a government and maintain control over it with all power in the people. That's people's law, right? Now in our course, we actually go through all the characteristics of ruler's law and people's law so that you'll have a better understanding of it. There isn't time to do that this morning, but those of you who have been through the course or who have the recorded tapes will know what I'm talking about. All right, now will you look at the little graph that we have on our book, which shows the arrow pointing over to the right to anarchy. Now I want somebody here in the audience to define anarchy for me. What would you say anarchy? Let's try some of our students. Where's some of our school students? Any high school students here that will help me on this? What's anarchy? Or what's a synonym for anarchy? Tell me what anarchy is. Yes, sir.
No law.
No law, exactly. And as a result, what do you get? What do you get if there's no law? Chaos, rioting, violence, robbery, all of the terrible things that go with irresponsible government. I spoke yesterday to high school down at Safford, and I just saw an example of anarchy at the drinking fountain. It was kind of interesting to watch it because most of the young people, the children, were all lined up patiently waiting for their drink. And a great big bustling kid that was almost twice as big as any that were in the line came in and took up about the third position. And he said, "This is my place in the line." And the little fellow right behind him says, "It isn't either. Go to the end of the line." And he says, "I'm in the right place, buddy." And he looked down at the little kid, and the little kid looked up at him, and you could just see he was just boiling with rage and indignation, and his rights had been violated. The orderly society had been violated. What could he do about it? There was no teacher around, so he couldn't do anything. He wasn't big enough. And I thought to myself as I looked at that big bully, someday, son, you're going to meet somebody who's taken judo lessons. And you're going to learn one of the facts of life as you go right flat on your back. But anyway, that's the way life is. Bullies always come to recognize the realities of life eventually. But as of that moment, at that drinking fountain, you had the rules of anarchy prevailing. The biggest could do anything he wanted to. He could have moved into the first position in line if he'd wanted to, shoved the whole line back, unless they ganged up on him, which they didn't. All right, now the founders, if you'll notice here on your little chart, the founders would have put no rule or no law above anarchy and ruler's law above tyranny. What's ruler's law? It's all power.
One man ruling in the institution.
Very often one man or a very small group of men, and it's all power in the ruler. He comes in with sword in hand, or his ancestors did. And he said, we would have not been allowed to win if it had not been by the blessing of the Almighty, and so we rule by the divine right of kings. You ever heard of that before? Tell you, Louis XVI believed in it until he was guillotined, and George III believed into it until we won our independence, and he at least didn't have any right over the Americas. Anyway, that's the way they believed it, the divine right of kings. Now, under ruler's law, the king looked upon the people as his subjects. Isn't that interesting? And he looked upon the whole country as his realm, you know. This is my realm. He'd trade off part of it, and amazing. People had no right. It was the king's land. And you go and commit a robbery, and instead of making the criminal pay back to his victim what he'd taken from him, it was the king's peace that had been violated. So he'd arrest the man and charge him a heavy fine. And who got the fine? Who got the fine? The king got the fine. So the poor fellow that was robbed, he's all black and blue, and he wanders off by himself. Are we still doing that? Isn't that amazing? And only recently have we begun to go back to the Anglo-Saxon principle of reparation to the victim. And reparation comes from the criminal, not from the taxpayers. Isn't that interesting? I could tell you more about that, but there isn't time. But anyway, that trend has started. Utah has now passed a law that when a criminal has been convicted, the judge is required to bring in the victim as they work out the proper punishment that makes the victim feel good and allows him to be compensated not only for the damages he suffered, but a little extra called punitive damages to teach the criminal, don't do this again. It's new, but we're about 200 years late. The Founding Fathers wanted all those principles put together, but we're beginning to get there. We'll gradually get back to these fundamentals. People's law right in the center is all power in the people. The land belongs to the people. The government belongs to the people. The rights of the people are equally protected. And government is not allowed to get so big that it can violate those rights. Unfortunately, that isn't typical of today's situation. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the founders are trying to find the balanced center. Will you underline Hamilton, please, in the next paragraph? Hamilton, come down 4 lines, where he said, there's a perpetual vibrations between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy. Now you see, this is where I found out in reading the Founding Fathers, they didn't talk about communism on the left and fascism on the right. This is where I began to hear them talking about the 2 extremes of anarchy and tyranny. And that just blazed like a fire in my brain as I saw the real way to measure governments. Now come down to the next, or on the same line really, will you write in Washington? Washington. He also says there is a natural and necessary progression from the extreme of anarchy to the extreme of tyranny. Can't somebody stop this momentum and this swinging pendulum in the center under the power of the people in the balanced center? Now will you come down a couple of lines to Franklin? Do you see Franklin down there? Underline Franklin. He was a great man. He says there's a natural inclination in mankind to kingly government. They just can't stand to take the time to govern themselves. This sound familiar? We have a local municipal ballot, and if you get more than 15% of the people to vote, you're lucky. At a highly sensational, glamorized election like that of a president, we barely get half the people who could vote to turn out and vote. So everybody's elected by a minority. We don't really know what the vast majority wanted, because about half of them stayed home and watched a game or something. I don't know what happened, but they didn't come. And Franklin said, I'm afraid that the United States will have a tendency to drift over toward a monarchy. Toward the last of that paragraph he says, I am apprehensive, therefore, perhaps too apprehensive, that the government of these states may in future times end in a monarchy. But this catastrophe, I think, may be long delayed if in our proposed system we do not sow the seeds of contention, faction, and tumult by making our posts of honor places of profit. What do you think about that? See, they wanted our political jobs to be sacrificial jobs. If they paid people something, it should be so far below or enough below the going market price for that kind of a job that only people who had a sense of service and dedication and commitment would go in there and work at it. Now we're getting more and more of those kind of people in office, but for quite a while, long enough for me to remember it, we had a lot of people running for office because they were unemployed. That was the main reason. I mean, it was another job because they were paying pretty good. Well, people are worthy of their hire. The good book says that. But if they're only running for the job because they need a job, they are not the right people. You've got to have people with good background, good experience. I see people that probably even well-meaning, coming out of a very modest professional life, taking over a city government with a $50 million budget. I mean, he's not even going to know how to do a cost analysis. He won't be able to understand the accountants when they bring in their story even. So we must say to our young people, prepare yourself for sound public service. That's what he's talking about here. All right, now, will you put down, and then the third line from the bottom, you'll find the word French Revolution. Will you put that in there? Underline that. Now go up to your little chart up above and put an X mark about a half an inch in from tyranny. Just put a little X. And up above it write, Louis XVI. That's Louis the 16th. Louis the 16th. Now, France was having a terrible time. Only about 5%, about 5 million out of 25 million people could read and write. They hadn't educated their people, they were poverty-stricken, and finally they couldn't endure it anymore. They wanted to overthrow their king and get something like America had won in its revolution, and so they started out. And Jefferson thought maybe it was going to be a wholesome revolution, but it went sour. And Robespierre, when he got control, swung that thing clear over to anarchy. He did it by this means. First of all, how did he get rid of how did the revolutionists get rid of the king and queen in France? Guillotine. And then the whole aristocracy was gathered up. Saint-Simon and Lafayette, Pierre, he almost lost his head. Was only saved by intervention of close friends. They were just executing anybody who was part of the aristocracy. And then Robespierre turned on his fellow revolutionists and said, I don't like you either. And there went another one. I don't like you either. And there went another one. Finally, you've just got the streets of Paris running with blood. And finally they said, somebody capture that monster. And so about the last one to be guillotined was Robespierre. Then the people said, for heaven's sakes, won't somebody restore order? And there was a little man standing there on the sidelines watching this fiasco. What was his name? Napoleon. He said, if you'll sign a contract and make me emperor, I'll tell you we'll have order restored immediately. Did they sign the contract? They did. Did he become emperor? He did. And immediately used the youth of France to try and take over all of Europe. The next generation of Frenchmen were 1 inch shorter because all the bigger men had been used and killed in military service, leaving the shorter men at home that sired the next generation. That interesting? Now you look at your little chart there. So you'll see the difference between these two revolutions. You didn't find the founding fathers guillotining, hanging, or executing anybody but outright traitors. They were tolerant. They tried to establish peace, harmony. We just want our freedom. Notice how they went from that little cross that you have called Louis the 16th clear across to total anarchy, where there was no responsible government. And they signed a contract, and where did the contract take them? Right back to Louis the 16th. Now that's what Hamilton is talking about. That's what he means by sensations of horror and disgust, which arise when a person studies the histories of those nations that are always in a state of perpetual vibration between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy. And I want to tell you, we can take our hats off to our founding fathers for stopping that pendulum dead center in 1787. But before they knew how to stop it in dead center, they almost tipped the whole boat over during the Revolutionary War with our first Constitution, which wasn't good at all. So will you go over into the next page? Right up at the top, in the second paragraph, it took 180 years to get to the American formula. That's from 1607 to 1787. Will you underline that? 180 years. 1607 to 1787. And then in the next line, the American formula. And their first attempt to do it, to write a constitution, almost made them lose the Revolutionary War. That's 3 lines down. Lose the Revolutionary War. Underline that. Now, when they decided they were going to go for independence, even before the Declaration of Independence, they tried to write a constitution. Thought they'd whip it off over the weekend, you know? So down there, about 2 inches down into the next paragraph, you'll find June the 11th, 1776. That's when John Dickinson, as chairman of the committee, was supposed to come up with a constitution. And he did in a couple of weeks. And the founders didn't like it. Well, you come down about another 2 inches over on the left-hand side and find November the 15th, 1777. That's when they finally adopted the Articles of Confederation. And the name is in the next paragraph. Under the Articles of Confederation, if you'll underline that, they wrote a constitution for a central government. Look what in the next line we underline: no executive, no judiciary, no taxing power, and no enforcement power. And that's why we almost lost the Revolutionary War. Why wasn't Washington able to say to Congress, punish those states if they don't come through with their assigned assessments? There wasn't any authority. All the Congress could do was to send some of their representatives around. They'd plead with Rhode Island, won't you send your assessment? They said, well, why not Massachusetts? They haven't sent theirs. He runs over to Massachusetts. Well, New York didn't send hers yet. You go to New York, well, Maryland hasn't sent hers yet. And that's how they dillied and dallied around with 2,000 men starving at Valley Forge, and what was it, the next year, another 2,000 starved and froze to death at Morristown. For Washington to have stood up under that kind of ludicrous indifference to the welfare of people who were fighting for our liberty would have crushed a man of lesser mettle. That's where my heart goes out to Washington, that he stood his ground when everything told him this thing is a colossal failure. But he said freedom has to be won even over the stupidity of the masses of the people who won't cooperate for their own good. Isn't that interesting? Our leadership that has been inspired has always been this way. They get the good idea, then they try to popularize it. Meanwhile, they go ahead and fight for it and work for it, hoping that the people who are indifferent will finally catch up with it, which they did. In due time, the Americans were just proud of George Washington. They made him president. They said, we're glad you stuck with it, while the rest of us were just doodling around. All right? Now will you come down to your little chart there at the bottom of the page. Notice where the Articles of Confederation are. Isn't that interesting? On the next page up at the top, will you underline Valley Forge and Morristown? Very few people have read about Morristown. It was a duplication of Valley Forge. It was just as bad. But we don't talk about that one for some reason or another. I've already told you about 6 weeks with flour, water, and salt. That's right in the middle of that paragraph. And then the figures that I gave you. 3,000 abandoned General Washington. 200 officers resigned. 2,000 soldiers died of starvation and disease and, of course, cold. And Washington attributed this disaster to our Constitution, called the Articles of Confederation. All right? Now, the genius of the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Not one of the founding fathers could have written that Constitution. It was the wisdom of all of them. At that time, come down to the 4th line. The states divided. Underline those 2 words. And on the same line, dollar was inflated to 1/10 of 1 cent. On the next line, the word depressed should be underlined. The whole economy was depressed. And the next line, rioting. And then underline New England and secede. The whole New England state segment was going to leave the Union. New York said good riddance. Now underline on the next line, England and Spain. Do you know that England wouldn't take her soldiers home? She left her soldiers parked on our territory, on our side of the line, up on the north side. She took them home from New York, but not along the north area until 1796, when she finally said, I guess they're going to make it. So in 1796 they went home. He said, when it went back across. Now Spain was coming up from the south. They even hired our former General Wilkinson, who'd fought in the Revolutionary War, to get the Indians stirred up so that Spain could come up and take over the Mississippi Valley on our side. And Washington just stood there in horror as he saw no tendency on part of the states to realize the terrible threat that was prevailing. All right? In the next paragraph, in the second line, will you underline the word frightening? Several of the founders said to go to the Constitutional Convention with the whole world watching us to see if we could come up with something was frightening, because we didn't know what we were going to do, and we were scared. You visualize them coming in with their powdered wigs, and everybody sitting down very sedately in their wool suits, terrible hot summer, everything, and then just writing the Constitution. Man, I want to tell you, this was 4 months of tough work with one brainstorming session after another. So will you put down here borrowed funds in that same paragraph, last line? They were there on borrowed funds. Come down 2 more lines and find the word brainstorming, because that's what they did. Who's got the best ideas? Well, they had the 15 Virginia resolutions as a kind of an agenda, but they had to brainstorm it. So what did they do? They shut all the doors. So will you underline the word secret? Down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th line. Secret. Okay, underline secret. Well, why was it so secret? You mean they didn't let the press in? Nope. Well, why not? Is that right? Well, they said, look, judge us by the thing when it's all finished. We don't want the newspapers in South Carolina telling how their representatives stood firmly for slavery and then compromised on just postponing it for 20 years, etc. They just wanted everybody to be able to change their minds and shift back and forth as they brainstormed it and came up with the right solution. Isn't that interesting? That's why it was secret. They said, you judge us by the final results. Now then, they got a problem. The Congress had said you were authorized to meet to amend the Articles of Confederation. Madison and the Virginia delegation said to the others, there is no hope in the Articles of Confederation. We need a whole different structure of government. And we're not passing any laws, we're only making recommendations. So it's perfectly legitimate for us to come up with something we feel proud of and that we can justify. And a few amendments on the Articles of Confederation is just like putting $1 billion paper patches on a boiler, like they're doing in Washington now, trying to get ahead of steam. He said it won't do it. We need a whole different structure. And so they went to the Congress with it. Now, some people are very critical of the convention for not having stayed within the limits of its authority. Well, Madison said, you've got to go back and give the lawmakers the authority to decide whether they will accept our proposal. And if our proposal is a bunch of patches on the Articles of Confederation that even we don't feel good about, of what value have we been to our country? So let's just go back to them with our complete new package and present it to them, which they did. And by the way, there wasn't one single word changed. The Congress talked about it for about 8 days, went through every part of the Constitution, turned it over to the states and said, we think this is just great. Well, of course, the states didn't. And they just quarreled like 60, and it took them about a year before, in fact, some of them longer than that, until they finally decided, well, now, if you'll just add a Bill of Rights, we'll feel all right. And the founders said, well, look, we didn't give that much power to the federal government. They don't have any power to violate your rights. Well, the state said, we don't trust them. You better say it anyway in a Bill of Rights. Washington saw that the big states especially were not going to accept the Constitution, and so he sent out the word, look, will you please accept the Constitution in this form and send us in what you would suggest by way of amendments. And guess what? They sent in 189 suggestions, and then they were boiled down by Madison to 12, and out of the 12, 10 were ratified by the states. All right, now will you just let me tell you about one final other thing which is kind of exciting. In order that there would be a great discussion of every point, and everybody would get a chance to say his bit, they used an interesting parliamentary device. How many of you have ever heard of a committee of the whole? Ever heard of a committee of the whole? Some of you have, okay. It was kind of exciting because this is what they would do. Here's the convention. Let's say that we're the convention. And we get to something and we start just hacking at it. I mean, we are quarreling. We are not happy at all with each other. We got opposite points of view. And someone will rise and say, Mr. President, meaning President Washington, who had been elected president of the convention, I move that we adjourn to the committee of the whole. Is there a second? Second. Is there a discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. So the ayes have it. We adjourn to the Committee of the Whole. Nobody moves except George Washington. He comes down off the podium, sits down, and a chairman that they have elected for the Committee of the Whole takes over. And he'll say, the Committee of the Whole will now be called to order. Is there a proposal to present to the Committee of the Whole? So somebody brings up the issue. And is there a second to it? There is a second. Now is there a discussion? And boy, they go after each other again like 60. And the only difference is, it doesn't matter what they vote on. It doesn't count. See, it's just a committee. They're just a committee now. It isn't the great convention coming to these monumental decisions. It's a committee. And they hash it. And boy, they go after one another and they work that thing over. And take, for example, a simple question like this. How many men do you want to be president? How many men do you want? James Wilson said, Mr. Chairman, see, this is the committee now. This isn't George Washington. It's the committee. Mr. Chairman, I think we need a single president, a strong president, functioning within a limited framework of authority. Oh, my Governor Randolph is on his feet from Virginia. Shades of King George. We don't want one president, we want at least three. One to represent New England, one to represent the Middle States, one to represent the Southern States. Safety in numbers, you know. Wilson is back on his feet again, James Wilson from Pennsylvania with his rich Scotch brogue, and wish I could imitate him, which I can't, but he said, there is no safety in numbers. Haven't you heard of the 30 tyrants of Greece? Now don't make the same mistake the Romans made by appointing 2 consuls. You must have one strong president, limited in his authority, but you must be able to fix responsibility without buck passing back and forth. And Randolph thought about it a little bit. In fact, finally, do you know what he did? He agreed with Wilson. The New Jersey states, New Jersey and the smaller states didn't agree right away. Now here's where I think the inspiration in the Constitution came about. A position is taken, it's opposed, they hash it, they get a little closer, they hash it some more, they get it, they keep going back and forth, they rock it back and forth until finally there is consensus. What's consensus? What's consensus, what would you call it? General agreement. Now that's what they tried to get. And it didn't matter how long it took. Let's all get our feelings ventilated till we feel good about it. Do you think that's a wholesome way to settle things? Now they did that. That's what took 4 months. They wanted to figure out how to elect the president. Do you know how many times they voted in the Committee on the Whole on the way to elect the president? 60 times. First they were going to have it done by the Senate. And then they voted that down. How about the House? They voted that down. How about the House and the Senate? They voted that down. How about the governors? They voted that down. And they would get variations, and it was 60 votes before they finally reached the Electoral College and made a consensus. We never really used the Electoral College quite right, but when it came up recently, Senator Bye tried to get it abolished, and it didn't go for a number of reasons. What we really need is a returning to the use of the Electoral College the way the founders intended, but it's become a partisan tool rather than the kind of program they had in mind. But be that as it may, it took them 60 ballots before they finally reached what I think was the point of inspired determination, arguing it back and forth. And everybody giving in as you see the other man has a point. You don't stubbornly hold out. You're all trying to find the answers. So you, oh yeah, I got you. I guess you have a good point there. And then they would concede a little and concede. And the other one would say, well, and maybe you had a point too that I hadn't thought about. So he'd shift over a little bit. And you got this shifting going back and forth until everybody feels good about it. We vote on it. Practically unanimous. That's good enough. Now I was told in school that the Constitution was a conglomerate of compromises. One of the main things I will hope you will remember from our seminar this morning, that nearly the whole Constitution was consensus. 3 compromises only. And they're up at the top of the next page. The third line, will you underline general agreement? And then the next line, underline except. And then write slavery, proportionate representation, and the regulation of commerce. Those were the three things they had to compromise on. And that means kind of giving in when you wished you didn't have to give in. The southern states definitely didn't want the federal government to regulate commerce because they wanted to sell to England, and they were fearful that New England states would make them sell to the textile mills at a cheaper price. So they held out on that one. Slavery, the southern states wanted to get rid of slavery, except South Carolina and one or two others. They said our slaves are all mortgaged to banks, particularly the European banks, and if you free the slaves just right now, why, they'll start coming in and foreclosing on our farms and everything else, and you'll have an economic disaster in the South. So give us a little time to phase it out. And so they worked out a compromise, and they decided to postpone it until 1808, 20 years, to give the South time to phase it out, which they didn't, unfortunately, and we ended up with a war between the states. Proportionate representation was solved by having all of the states equal in the Senate, and then having the population equally represented in the House. That's how that went. Those are the only three compromises. The rest, consensus. And everybody but three men signed the Constitution, and those three didn't sign it because it lacked a Bill of Rights, which we subsequently got. Right? In the next paragraph, first line, underline September 17, 1787, because that's when President Washington attached a letter and sent it to the Congress and said, we think this will make us the first free people in modern times on a perpetual basis. Now, as I mentioned to you, there was attached to it 189 amendments, and that's 4 lines from the bottom of that paragraph. See that at 189? And down on the next line, 12. You want to underline 12? And then underline James Madison, who wrote the Bill of Rights, based primarily on the writings of George Mason, who had done almost the same thing for the Virginia Bill of Rights. And only 10 of them were ratified by the states. There were 2 that were not ratified. One we later ratified in the 14th Amendment. Isn't that interesting? We picked that up later. The other one, it should have been repealed. The states were right in rejecting it. And then underline Bill of Rights. Now, when we started doing this work, putting this all together about 14 years ago, and then we started a program of trying to train people. Nobody was interested. Would you like to study the Constitution? Yeah, sometime. Well, it's exciting. I'm sure it is. Sometime. And in the beginning, the only people I could get to come and study it were my own students at Brigham Young University. And so we set up a little building. My family and I, we divided our salary right in 2, and that's not much from a school teacher, but anyway, we divided it in 2, and I was getting a little money from my books, and we divided our income in 2 to rent a little building and a telephone and a secretary and get this program started on July the 4th, 1971. Specifically designed to popularize the restoration of the Constitution in the tradition of the Founding Fathers. And you'll notice that our logo is the Hall of Independence, where the Declaration of Independence was written, and also the Constitution. And over the top of it, it says, restoration of the Constitution in the tradition of the Founding Fathers. That's what this is all about. Here, 10 years later, got about 140,000 graduates that we know about. Others, I'm sure, have studied it we don't know about. And all of a sudden, it has not only broken loose in the United States, but these same principles now are being inculcated in the model constitution that we were invited to write for Canada. In October, we're presenting the model constitution. We don't call it the Constitution of the United States, you see. We call it a model constitution. It's going to Israel in October. Last Monday, we were invited to bring it to West Germany. We now have a letter to bring it down to Australia. New Zealand is interested. A total of 18 countries want to hear the Founding Fathers' marvelous success formula. Now, guess what our greatest task is? to get it accepted in the United States. We're having difficulty finding enough people like you. And I have men come up to me all the time and say, my wife strong-armed me into coming, almost threatened to divorce me if I didn't, but I'm glad I did. I wouldn't have come on my own initiative. Will you remember that for your family and your relatives? Now, we've done something to make it easy to study the Constitution in your own home. Took us a long time to put it together, but we finally succeeded. And we put this whole course, all the things that I'm telling you, and a lot more besides, we put on cassette tapes, 13 hours long, with a study guide to go with it so that everybody would understand what's been going on. Now, I have some rather exciting things to tell you toward the end, and so I'm going to have you underlining kind of fast here for a minute, because I've covered the main points that will help you realize why the Constitution Week is so important to commemorate. And I just want to emphasize now what happened to get us into our present predicament so that you can realize what's happening in Washington, from which I just returned. At the bottom of page 5, will you underline political equilibrium? That's what the Constitution was supposed to do, to maintain a balance between the states and the federal government. And so in the next line, underline states and federal government. And I've given you the quotation there from Madison that will describe the kind of a pattern they were trying to build. And if you'll turn to page 6, you'll see a diagram of where the American eagle should be if you want the United States to remain prosperous and free. Now, down in the next paragraph, we talk about America's three-headed eagle. It had never been done before, but underline the names of the men who had advocated it. Polybius, John Locke, Baron Charles de Montesquieu. They all had said that the three departments of government should be separated and then coordinated. And then underline, next to the last line, American founders were the first, very first ones to do this. Now look at this symbol of the three-headed eagle down here at the bottom. You'll notice that the central head is called the legislative head, and it has two eyes, and these must see eye to eye before any law can become, or any act can become a law. That's up at the top of the next page. Will you write in legislative function in the first line? And then on the next line it says two eyes. Come down then two more lines where it says executive department. And then the first word 4 more lines down says judiciary. That's the third head. Now, the genius of these three heads is that they only have one neck. And that's the last word of the second line in the next paragraph. They have a single neck. And that was the genius of the system. First separating those heads into independent departments, then letting them have to work through the same neck so that if any of them become abusive, the other two have a peaceful power to pull them back into position. And so this gives us what we call coordination without consolidation. And those are famous words. Now let me just show you one other thing that the American eagle symbol represents, which is powerful. It has two wings, let us say. And wing number 1, the wing on the left there, is the problem-solving wing, or the wing of compassion. And so if you'll underline wing of compassion in the second line of the next paragraph, right under the eagle, the wing of compassion is number 1. Now that's the one that says we can do it better. You know we could do it better. Let's solve these problems. That's fine. Now you need the other wing to fly. Wing number 2 is the conserving wing, which conserves resources and freedom. Resources and freedom. That's the wing that says, oh, you've got a good plan for solving Social Security. How much does it cost, and what will it do to our freedom? If we would have had a wing number 2 flying in 1935, you wouldn't have a bankrupt Social Security system today such as we have. And if there's time this morning, I'll give you the answer to that one. The Founding Fathers had a much better program than the one that's been suggested. If the wing number 2 goes to sleep and doesn't ask about our freedom and our resources, and wing number 1 starts solving problems no matter what the cost is, that wing number 1 is going to pull the American eagle over in what direction? Toward the left. And what's over there? Tyranny, oppression, too much government. All right? What if wing number 1 goes to sleep and wing number 2 just sits there, like a stick in the mud and says, I'm okay, and I guess everybody else is okay, so we won't pay any attention to our problems. What direction does that make the American eagle fly? Yeah, over toward anarchy or discredited government where the people begin to do it themselves. And integrated government breaks down. Do you see how important both of these are? If both wings fly, one saying, let's solve our problems, the other one saying, all right, be sure we can afford it, and be sure that it doesn't destroy our freedom, you get that American eagle flying higher than any civilization in the history of mankind. Everybody caught the vision of that? All right, now we let the wing number 1 get way out of control here beginning in 1913. And we've reaped a harvest of real difficulties. Now I have here next Thomas Jefferson describing the need for a perfect balance. I'm not going in detail on that except to say we ought to have both wings in our personalities. We ought to be problem solvers, and at the same time we ought to conserve our freedom and our resources. Some people say to Dr. Skousen, are you a conservative? And I say, no, I'm a problem-solving progressive, which means both wings. That's a problem-solving progressive. Okay? And so if they ask if we're right wing, no, we're in the, what do we call it? Balanced center. All right? See if you can say the words. We are problem-solving progressives in the balanced center of the political spectrum. Very good. Now they will try to then say, are you moderates? That means people who don't really know where they're going. No, we're not moderates in that sense. We're in the balanced center, but we know where we're going. Straight up. That's where we're headed. All right? Now will you turn over to page 10, please? I want you to, in the second paragraph, will you underline Washington? And here's a nice quote for you to remember, and you can underline it if you wish. Our business is to march straight forward without turning either to the right or left. Isn't that a beautiful quote? When I read that in his writings, it just came up like a neon sign. Neither to right nor to left. All right, now, down in the last paragraph, will you underline the words beginning in the second line? The founders warned against a number of temptations. At the top of the next page, they warned against a welfare state where the government agrees to take care of us from the cradle to the grave. Sounds so good. So you put welfare state. Listen to Jefferson. If we can prevent the government from wasting the labors of the people under the pretense of taking care of them, they must become happy. Now, how would a government waste the labors of the people? What's that called? Excessive taxes. That's the way they waste the labors of the people. Have our taxes been wasted, do you think, under these programs? They've found $44 billion alone just recently in the General Accounting Office that have either been stolen, embezzlement, or just absolutely flittered away. All right? So will you put, underline prevent government in that particular quote? Furthermore, Jefferson said it's immoral for one generation to stack the next generation with its extravagance. In other words, spend a lot of money this generation and pass it on to the next. The founders said every generation is morally responsible for paying off its own debts. Now, we are the first generation that violated that. Every other generation of Americans tried to pay off its own debts within its lifetime. We're the first ones that just went ahead and said, it doesn't matter. Deficit spending, oh, it's so much fun. We're having such a good time. Hoop it up. All right. The Founding Fathers also believed in equal protection of rights. Now that's down in the third paragraph, second line. Can you find it? Equal protection of rights. The founders also warned that the only way for the nation to prosper was to have equal protection of rights, not allow the government to get involved trying to provide equal distribution of things. But how can you have equal justice for all if we don't have the same number of things, right? So we got Rousseau and these other people saying it is not just unless we've all got the same number of things. Well, now you just think about that for a minute. I got a man that doesn't live very far from me, and he's got 50 cows. Man, I don't want them. I really don't want them. I want my milk in cartons. I've had my day of milking cows. Now, in our basement, until very recently, we had about 5,000 books. I wonder if his wife wants to have an equal number of our books. Just ask my wife. We finally put them in a library in the Freeman Institute. But anyway, as fast as our 8 children moved out, we filled the rooms with books. I say we, editorially speaking. And anyway, it's out of that library that much of this has come forth, and that was very important to me. People don't want equal things. They want different kinds of houses, different kinds of gardens. Some people are satisfied with very modest a little place to live just so they got a Cadillac to ride in. Have you noticed that? You noticed that? I see little what we used to call little shacks, but they got $1,000 colored television. Well, that's what's important to them. So anyway, they said don't get the government involved in trying to distribute equal things because it just doesn't work and it violates the desires of the people. So they said we're going to make it unconstitutional. They said we will make socialism and communism unconstitutional. Would you like to have the quote on that? All right, here it is, Sam Adams. The utopian schemes. What's a utopian? Here, you students, tell me what a utopia is. What does it mean? It's a no land. Utopia means a no land. It doesn't exist, never could exist. It's a fairy tale land. So a utopian scheme belongs to what? Fantasyland, right? Not Disneyland, but Fantasyland. The utopian schemes of leveling, that's the redistribution of wealth, and a community of goods, which means revolution or communism, are as visionary and impractical as those which vest all power in the crown, or property in the crown. Then he went on to say that these ideas are arbitrary, despotic, and in our government, unconstitutional. There it is. Now, I wish that we could have gotten that out in a big signboard in front of the Capitol in 1913, because that's when they started, by usurpation, violating all kinds of constitutional principles. Turned over the power to issue and maintain the control of our money to the Federal Reserve System. That was the beginning of it. They passed an act called the 16th Amendment, which allowed them to start gobbling up our money in any quantity they wanted. They said it'll never go above 3%. Don't worry. They should have written that into the amendment. I mean, you know where it is now. Anyway, the Founding Fathers were very concerned about the poor. And one of the reasons that they think that you to take from the haves and give to the have-nots is to take care of the poor. Well, Benjamin Franklin had been a have-not. He knew all about the have-nots. So he got over there to England and he was disgusted with government welfare programs because guess what he saw it doing? Institutionalizing dependency and poverty from generation to generation. All right? On the fourth line, will you underline haves and have-nots and the word Benjamin Franklin. Then come down to 4 lines above the bottom of that paragraph where it says, where he is quoted as saying, legal provision for the poor in England is a very great evil. And then he goes on to say, we've copied you, but it's evil in our country too, so we're going to try and get rid of it, which they did until our day. Now come down to the next one. He said compassion is a God-given responsibility. We are all supposed to be concerned about the poor. But there is such a thing as counterproductive compassion. That's in the next paragraph. Underline counterproductive compassion. And look at the examples that he gives of counterproductive compassion. Number one, compassion which gives a drunk the means to increase his drunkenness is counterproductive compassion. Would you agree? Obviously. Compassion which breeds debilitating dependency and weakness is counterproductive. Compassion which blunts the desire or necessity to work for a living is counterproductive. And 4, compassion which smothers the instinct to strive and excel is counterproductive. Now then he goes on to say, and will you underline the next paragraph, the words, mandate of God to help the poor. Our Creator expects us to help the poor. But the founders had some rules for helping the poor, and they're up on the next page. Number 1, do not help the needy completely. Merely help them to help themselves. Underline to help themselves. Number 2, give the poor the satisfaction of earned achievement, and that's underlined, instead of rewarding them without achievement. Number 3, allow the poor to climb the appreciation ladder. Underline appreciation ladder. From tents to cabins, cabins to cottages, cottages to comfortable houses. Right? Now our family went up the appreciation ladder. We came out of Canada when I was a boy with absolutely nothing except 8 horses and a lot of children, a Bain wagon. We'd lost farm, home, everything during the 1921-22 depression in Canada. We went to California. We lived in tents for 2 years. We kids thought we were on a perpetual vacation. And we milked goats. And we spent an average of $5 in cash per week for food. Of course, bread was 10 cents. That made a difference. That was before inflation. And we didn't have any taxes to pay in those days. People bought homes once they got going in just 2 or 3 years. 85% of all the people owned their own homes because they weren't paying a lot of taxes. I like that. Within 8 years, my mother and father had built a dream home in San Bernardino with adequate facilities and private bedrooms for 8 children. They did that in 8 years. My father went back up to Canada and paid off every debt that he owed to the people in Canada. We did that in 8 years, in the old days. Now, I just wanted to share that with you because if you have the system operating without taxing the people to death and keeping the society open so that we started out digging slush pits in the oil wells, and the kids were dishwashers and water carriers. We did all kinds of things. But we got to keep all the money we made. See, that's the nice part about it. We kept it all. And finally, within 8 years, they've got a beautiful family home. You could do that. Some did it in less time than that. All right, the next one is, where emergency help is provided, that's number 4, do not prolong it to the point where it becomes habitual, and underline habitual. Under our government welfare program, we have the 3rd generation still enjoying public welfare and never intending to get off of it. Number 5, should strictly enforce the scale of fixed responsibility. Underline that. The first and foremost level of responsibility is with the individual himself. The second level is the family, then the church, next the community, finally the county, and in a disaster or emergency, the state and federal government. But only in a temporary emergency. The founders felt it would corrupt the government and also the poor if the state and the federal government became permanently involved in welfare. All right, now at this point, we can't help but ask ourselves, what shifted the American eagle away from the balanced center? And in order to appreciate that, I have to give it to you very quickly. You can read it in more detail in your study guide when you get home or in your lesson here. But in 1900, we had very wealthy men that had contributed so much to make us the greatest industrial nation in the world lose confidence in the system. I think I can understand their psychology, like Andrew Carnegie. He had built U.S. Steel. He could just snap his fingers like that, you see, and we'd have a steel mill built in some small community. He said, I want a library in every small town in America. Boom, and they were there. I don't know how about you, but I read all my early books from the Carnegie libraries around the country. It was wonderful. He knew what was good for the people. They need books. They need libraries. Snap the fingers. We got libraries with Carnegie money. And you got J.P. Morgan. He built our transcontinental railroad system. A wonderful contribution. And then you take a man like John D. Rockefeller, who wanted American oil to be the finest oil in the world, and so he called his system the Standard Oil. He said to other wildcat companies that were selling badly refined oil, you either come into my company for which I'll give you stock and make you rich, or I'll just wipe you out of existence. All American oil's got to come up to a standard. And it was a great contribution in its way. I didn't appreciate Standard Oil service stations till I got over to Europe. They had no facilities, and no restrooms, nothing. I mean, they were run-down little hinky-dink, rinky-dink things. I thought, hooray for Standard Oil and the American system. Well, in any event, he had a high ideal, but he lost confidence in the system. You want to go down to Washington and get anything accomplished? It's slow. There's none of this. You got to get the bill introduced, assigned to a committee. They hold hearings. And we have to publicize it. We have to talk it up. Trying to get, what's that magic word? What's the word? Consensus. Will you remember that? Consensus or agreement. Trying to get consensus. That's too slow. We ought to have an executive that could say, let's have a library in every town. Let's have transcontinental highways. Let's have transcontinental railroads. Let's have more of this and more of that. We ought to have some more of this snapping of the finger stuff. Right? More power to the executive. Now I want you to listen to a couple of American senators. Turn over here on page 16. I want you to listen to Senator Joseph Clark, who had taken an oath to sustain the Constitution, saying we should abandon it. All right, now listen to this. We have inherited from our forefathers, right down at the bottom of the page, we have inherited from our forefathers a governmental structure which so divides power that effective dealing with the economic problems is cumbersome. See, you see that hunger for the snapping of the fingers? Of course, inaction is what the founding fathers intended. Inaction until such time as overwhelming, what's the word? Consensus was prepared for action. They were right in their day, they were wrong in ours. And I want to stop right there for a moment and tell you about ERA. Because when equal rights for women was presented to the American people, everybody felt that that would be a good progressive step. There were some laws that did not allow equal rights for women. We ought to get them off the books. Let's have equal rights for women. So the ERA amendment went through Congress slick as a whistle. It was questioned, but only slightly. It got out into 30 of the states who passed it, I think, the first year. And then some women got to reading the act, the amendment. It didn't mention women. They said, hey, wait a minute. Something is wrong here. This not only doesn't mention women, but it sets up a neutral position on the part of government so that all the rights that women have won over the years as women are automatically canceled out. That law that says you can't make women carry a 100-pound sack of flour upstairs or fire her for not carrying it up there. ERA, and she's got to carry it up or they'll fire her. She can't any longer get advantages in insurance because women have a longevity rate than men. She's going to have to help pay for men who die younger. That's especially bad for young girls who have to pay the accident rate insurance for young boys who have the worst accident rate in the nation. Girls are going to have to share the cost of those expenses. Furthermore, a housewife that doesn't have other forms of income can't get any credit under ERA without the signature of her husband. How come? Well, under our present law, the law says a husband is responsible for the support of his wife and family. And if he's working, she can go down and sign up credit in any store in town unless the husband's advised the stores not to. But under ERA, no. The husband hasn't got that responsibility anymore. It's divided between the husband and the wife. And if she hasn't got a source of income, she'll not get any credit without her husband's signature. See, the men should have been gung-ho for this maybe, but they weren't. They wanted equal rights for women. And the ERA was going in the opposite direction. So do you know what stopped ERA cold? Do you know what stopped it? Millions of women. They said, this is a fraud. This isn't what we were told it was at all. See, I was for ERA till I read it. I like everybody else. No, that was a great disservice to the women of America. We want equal rights for women, and we've got nearly all of them remedied now. There were a number of areas we needed bills passed, and we've passed them now. So a woman can get equal rights on employment, on credit, on housing, almost anything now. All she has to do is use it. Now that's what I wanted to stop there so you'd get an example of why the founders said, take it slow, will you? Give every law a good shake until you get, what's that word? Consensus. And man, we almost stumbled into consensus without reading the amendment. I don't think Congress read it very well. Everybody said, this is equal rights for women. Oh, good, we're for that. I want the women's vote. Anyway, we finally woke up to what was going on. Listen to him now. He said, they were right in their day, they're wrong in ours. We need some of that fast decision making. I have no hesitation in stating my deep conviction that the legislatures of America, meaning the people's representatives, local, state, and national, are presently the greatest menace to the successful operation of the democratic process. They want a dictator. He's asking for a president with dictatorial authority. Snap the fingers. The executive should be strengthened at the expense of the legislature. Surely we've reached the point where we can say that Jefferson was wrong, that government is not best which governs least. That's coming from a United States senator that had taken an oath to uphold the Constitution and doing everything that he can to turning it into a fascist dictatorship. Well, as a result of that trend, which was greatly accelerated in our generation, they came to the American people in the midst of the Depression in 1932 with the most magnificent platform. One of the best platforms in U.S. history is the Democratic platform of 1932. Promised everything good. Cut the cost of government, get the money supply flowing again, let the system work and get us back on the track. It was ideal. And it was going to reduce government regulations and government bureaus and everything. It's all the people needed, a little freedom. And by 1936, the former head of the Democratic Party spoke to a convention in New York City named Alfred Smith and gave one of the most courageous political speeches in the history of the United States. He said, our platform has been betrayed. And we are not getting American solution. We are getting the socialist pie-in-the-sky solution. And I'm going to go through every plank of that platform and point out to this body of my fellow party members that they're allowing the leadership to betray what we promised we would give the American people. It's a great speech. And in The Naked Capitalist, I put in the whole speech. And I just thrill with that kind of an American. Here was a great Democrat. So we were getting socialism. Now will you go over to page 19. Here's the head of the Democratic Socialist Party, Norman Thomas. Oh, he was excited. He said, we don't need a socialist party anymore. We're getting it all. And we're getting it in the name of one of the national parties. And don't believe it was just Democrats either. We had a lot. You get Jacob Javits of New York, Republican senator of New York, hardcore socialist. He always voted socialism. And the Republicans just rid themselves of him in the 1980 election. But he had a constitutional voting record of about 0 all through the years. Listen to Norman Thomas after the Republicans took over. Why, he said, we're getting even more socialism than we had before. See, it didn't matter which party was in, the thing was popular. Take from the haves, give to the have-nots, let the government solve all our problems. It was winning elections and destroying the Constitution. So what we needed was a revival of grassroots Democrats and grassroots Republicans who said, we want to be Americans again. We don't want to be socialists. We don't want to be communists. We want America back. We want America. In 1962, right at the bottom of the page, Norman Thomas summed up the whole situation as follows. He says, the difference between Democrats and Republicans is the Democrats have accepted some ideas of socialism cheerfully, while the Republicans have accepted them reluctantly. Well, turn over the page. You want to see where the American eagle is? She's situated far to the left. Now, I want you to notice where those lines are going from the American eagle. They were supposed to go down to the state level. Look where they go now. Right into your farm, right into your home, right into your bank account. And I've listed the areas in which it is now unconstitutionally operating. Land, schools, air, water, energy, health, welfare, labor management problems, intrastate, meaning inside the state, commerce, industrial production, 5,000 regulations on steel alone. Why, in Utah we mine iron. You can put it on a train, ship it to San Francisco, send it over to Japan, refine it, make it into steel, ship it all the way back, and it will sell for less in Utah than the steel we're making right at the Geneva steel plant. See, that's not America. 5,000 regulations, priced our steel right out of the world market. We did the same with electronics, radio, television. Now we're doing it to automobiles. It's not America. We're a very competitive people under the free market economy of the founders, but not this. City beautification, sewage disposal, electric power, thermal power, police problems, etc., and etc. Now that's what Americans said in 1980. There weren't enough Republicans to elect a president. So the Democrats joined in, and Mr. Reagan was carrying a banner which sounded pretty much, or looked pretty much, like the signal of the Democrats in 1932. He was saying about the same thing the Democrats were. It's what Americans have always wanted. So Democrats joined, and he won overwhelmingly because that's what the people want. Now, do you know what's thrilled me? I just got back from Washington. They're doing it. You know, there's a campaign, and then they get in office, and then there's something else. No, we're getting the same thing as the campaign. And I'm kind of happy about it. Now, there have been some people critical of this and that, and I'm sure they're going to make some more. They have made some mistakes, but it's kind of exciting that they're beginning to get what they promised they would give. Now, I only have time to go through a few of those things for you, but I just want to give you a report from Washington. Maybe you ought to look up at the top of page 21 if you want to see what this collectivism, federalism, and socialism has given us. A deteriorating money system. Is our dollar reliable anymore? Can you tell from year to year where it's going to be? See, I'm old enough to remember, and so are some of you. Some of you even have more hair than I have, but it's gray, so I imagine you belong to my generation. They promised us going off the gold standard would not allow inflation to come in. Remember that? Don't worry about it. It'll make things better. All right, we got a deteriorating money system, a frightening rate of inflation, a monumental national debt of $1 trillion, more than all other nations of the world combined. That ought to shock somebody. 4, a crushing burden of taxes, a tidal wave of federal regulatory agencies. 6, a deteriorating national morality. And 7, a shattering of traditional family life. Number 8, the abandonment of many important constitutional principles. 9, a serious invasion of traditional states' rights. Now, much of this has come about as the result of most Americans not being trained in the American system. And that was true of myself. I was a political science major, and then I went into law. I didn't have to read John Locke. We didn't even study the Constitution except the nuts and bolts of how you put it together. We didn't know why they did it that way, or what was the strength of separation of powers, or how the checks actually worked. We didn't really understand that. Nor did we understand the wisdom of the founders' success formula. I just want to bring you this little message of hope in closing. I don't think the great Creator set us up as the first free people in the history of modern times to lose that freedom if we would do our part. I think He expected we would do our part. we don't do it unless we're properly informed and know the correct principles. So that's why I appreciate all of you, supported by the right kind of informed Americans. And with God's help, we're going to win this battle. I know He wants us to. Thank you very much.